I was in my early 20s when it happened. My date and I had gone to the Sail Inn in West Sacramento for a game of pool. It was a place we liked, the kind of dive bar where the neon glow softened the edges of everything, and the drinks were strong but cheap. We had been there a few times before, drawn in by the bartender. She was a striking woman, confident with a magnetic energy that made you feel like an old friend, even if she had just met you. Her name escapes me now, but I remember her smile. That night, the pool table was occupied by a man and a woman. Something about them made me pause. They weren't a couple in the usual sense. There was no warmth between them, no shared laughter. She was quiet, almost unnaturally so, standing just slightly behind him, her expression blank. While my date went to grab our drinks, I stood nearby, watching their game. The man noticed me almost immediately, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through me. He smiled, easy and confident, and started a conversation like he'd known me forever. There was something slick about him, something too practiced. By the time my date returned, the man was already inviting us to play around with them. I hesitated. The woman hadn't spoken a single word. She just watched him, waiting. Still, we agreed, and as the game progressed, so did his questions. Casual at first, then something else. Where do you live? Have you been together long? Do you live alone? His eyes never left mine as he asked, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. I forced a smile, keeping my answers vague. A slow, creeping dread settled in my stomach. I glanced at the woman. She was still silent, her gaze flicking to him, then back to me. An unspoken message passed between them. The hairs on my arms rose. When the game ended, the man grinned. "Hey, you guys should come with us. We know this great little bar not far from here." I hesitated, but he pressed again. "Come on, it'll be fun." My date shifted beside me, waiting for my response. I wanted to say no, but I felt the weight of the man's stare, the expectation in it. The air felt thick, wrong. Something was happening, something I couldn't name but could feel in my bones. "No thanks," I blurted. "We have dinner plans." That was a lie. A desperate, clumsy lie. For a second, something flickered in the man's expression. Annoyance? Frustration? But then, just as quickly, he smiled again, all charm and ease. "Suit yourselves." We grabbed our jackets and left. The moment the door swung shut behind us, my body tensed like I had just stepped out of a trap. The night air was cold against my skin, but I was sweating. I felt exposed, like something unseen was reaching for me. By the time we got to my truck, my nerves were raw. My date noticed. "What's wrong?" I exhaled sharply. Something about them felt wrong. He didn't even check with her before inviting us, and she never spoke. My voice was barely above a whisper. "I think we just got lucky." He shrugged it off, probably thinking I was being paranoid. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. A few days later, I opened the afternoon paper. A woman had been found murdered in West Sacramento. My stomach tightened, but I didn't think much of it. Not until I turned the page and saw her face, the bartender, the beautiful, engaging woman from the Sail Inn. She had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered the very night we had been there. My skin went cold. My mind raced. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, a horrible, tragic coincidence. But then, a month later, another article. 2 people had been arrested for the bartender's murder, and for the murders of several others, including 4 couples. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the front page of the Sacramento Bee. Gerald and Charlene Gallego. I knew those names. I knew those faces. The couple from the bar, the people who had invited us out that night. I gripped the newspaper with trembling hands, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Their method was now clear. They lured victims out, away from safety, and into their van. We had been next, and when we refused, they simply found someone else. In the early 90s, I worked at a convenience store just outside of Birmingham, Alabama. It wasn't anything glamorous, long shifts, tough customers, and a boss who barely acknowledged my existence, but it paid the bills. The store was in an industrial area, so the mornings were always a rush of workers, grabbing coffee, cigarettes, and lottery tickets before clocking in. The only time it ever slowed down was for a brief, eerie 30-minute window just before lunch. That's when Jack would usually show up. Jack was an unassuming man, maybe late 40s, always polite but never particularly chatty. 3 times a week, like clockwork, he'd pull up to pump number 5 and buy exactly $10 in gas. Not a penny more, not a penny less. We had the kind of customer-clerk relationship built on routine. A nod, a quick exchange of pleasantries, and he'd be on his way. Then one day, everything changed. Jack started lingering. At first, it was casual, small talk about the weather, current events, the state of the country. But over time, his questions grew more personal. He asked about my family, my 6-month-old son, even my frustrations with the job. In return, he shared bits of his life, his work at the railroad, how he'd spent years around heavy machinery, how it had toughened him. At the time, I was actively looking for a way out of that job, and on a whim, I asked if the railroad had any office positions available. Jack's face lit up. "Actually," he said, almost too quickly, "there's an opening for a receptionist. If you want it, I can get you hired." "No problem." It seemed too good to be true. I didn't hesitate to fill out an application. When I handed it to him, I felt a rush of excitement I hadn't felt in years. Jack took it with an odd smile and said he'd get back to me in a day or two. Then he disappeared. A week passed with no word. I wasn't too concerned at first, but then one evening, the second shift guy at the store called me at home. "Hey," he said, voice tense. "Some guy came in asking for you. Said it was urgent. Left a number, but no name." My stomach twisted. Something about it felt off. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. I dialed the number. After 4 rings, an elderly woman answered. Her voice was frail but warm. I explained who I was, where I worked, and that I had no idea who I was calling. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "that must be my Jackie. He said someone might call. Give me your number, precious, and I'll have him ring you when he gets in. Whenever that may be. He's been gone since early this morning." "Jackie?" I hung up, uneasy. That wasn't his name. Or was it? I realized then that I knew almost nothing about this man. Another week passed. Still no Jack. Then everything shattered. Another late-night call from the second shift guy. "Turn on the 10 o'clock news," he said. "That guy, Jack, he's on it." The moment his face flashed on the screen, my blood ran cold. Jack, kind, quiet, intelligent Jack, had been arrested. For murder. My jaw dropped. This had to be a mistake. Not Jack. He wasn't capable of something like that, was he? 2 days later, detectives walked through the doors of the store, asking for me by name. "We need to talk about Jack," one of them said, voice heavy. I stammered, confused. I barely knew him. He was just a customer." Then they told me why they were there. They had found my job application. Blood-soaked. It was in his van, along with detailed notes, my work schedule, when I arrived, when I left, even my home address. The same van where he had committed a gruesome murder. The detective's eyes were grim. "By God's grace," he said, "you couldn't reach him that night. You were most likely next." A chill crawled up my spine. Had he planned to kill me first? Or was I meant to be his next victim? The answer didn't matter. Either way, I had escaped a fate too horrific to comprehend. And the final revelation? Jack never worked for the railroad. Hell, he didn't work at all. He lived off his mother. And I had almost handed my life right into his hands. It was my dad's 30th birthday, a milestone we wanted to celebrate in a big way. My mom had gone all out, planning a surprise party and inviting a bunch of people from his work. The house was packed, adults laughing, glasses clinking, music playing. My brother and I, just kids at the time, weren't exactly interested in the grown-up chatter. So, we did what we always did, escaped to our room, shut the door, and lost ourselves in the pixelated world of our Sega Genesis. That was when he walked in. A man we didn't recognize, tall and lean, with an unsettling stillness about him. He didn't knock, he didn't hesitate. He just entered, like he belonged there, like he had every right to sit on my bed and watch us. His presence sent an eerie chill through the room, despite the warm glow of the game screen. "What you playing?" he asked casually, but his voice had an edge to it, something forced, like he was trying too hard to sound friendly. "Sonic," my brother mumbled, barely glancing at him, too focused on the game. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Cool," he said. "You guys play a lot?" Something about him felt wrong. Not just out of place, but off in a way I couldn't explain. His eyes flicked between us, studying, evaluating. Then came the questions. Too many, too fast. "You take the bus to school?" I hesitated. "Yeah, sometimes." "How old are you guys?" my brother answered. I stayed quiet. "What's your favorite food?" It was the way he asked that sent a shiver down my spine. Not like he was making small talk, but like he needed to know, like it mattered. I glanced at my brother. He was still playing, pretending not to notice, but I could tell he felt it too, the wrongness of it all. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Then, as if she could sense it, my mom appeared in the doorway. Her expression shifted the second she saw him sitting there. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowed, and for a moment the noise from the party outside seemed distant, muffled. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. The man, Danny, as he'd introduced himself, just smiled. "Oh, just watching the boys play." My mom's lips pressed into a thin line. "Come on, boys, go watch a movie in my room." It wasn't a suggestion. I didn't argue. Neither did my brother. We hopped off the bed and squeezed past Danny, who stayed there a moment longer before finally standing and leaving without another word. That should have been the end of it. Just a weird guest at my dad's party. But months later, I found out how close we had come to something much, much darker. I was in the living room when I heard my mom gasp. I turned to see both my parents frozen, eyes glued to the TV screen. On the news, they were showing a mugshot, a face I recognized instantly, though this time there was no forced smile, just cold, empty eyes. Daniel Conahan Jr., the Hog Trail killer, a man who had tortured and murdered more than a dozen men, tying them to trees in the woods and leaving them to die. I felt sick. The memory of him sitting on my bed asking those strange, probing questions sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. He had been there, in our house, alone with us, and we had no idea how close we had been to real, unthinkable danger. Back in the 80s, my mom lived in a bedsit, a cramped shared accommodation where the walls were thin and the locks felt like a formality rather than real security. It was the kind of place where young women, students, and those just trying to get by came and went at all hours, laughing, drinking, living. That night, she was the only one home. Her housemates had gone out drinking hours earlier, leaving the place eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by and the hum of a street lamp outside her window. She was getting ready for bed when a knock at the door shattered the silence. Not a light tap, a firm, deliberate knock. Her stomach tensed. It was 11 p.m. No one was expected. Instead of opening the door, she did something that, in hindsight, probably saved her life. She leaned out her window and called down, "Who is it?" Below, standing half in shadow, was a man. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. In one hand, he held a briefcase, an odd accessory for the late hour. "I have a business meeting with the company downstairs," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Something wasn't right. She frowned. At this hour? The man didn't move, didn't shift awkwardly as people often do when making conversation. And most unsettling of all, he wouldn't look up at her. He kept his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, like he was trying to avoid being seen properly. A slow dread curled in her gut. "If you have a meeting, call them," she said, her voice firm. Still, he didn't leave. He lingered there, his presence thick in the air, stretching the moment out like something unnatural. She could feel it, something predatory, something wrong. She told him to go away, shut the window, and listened. No footsteps, no movement. He was still there. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he left. The next day, she reported the incident to the police, uneasy but not fully understanding the weight of what she had narrowly avoided. The world moved on. Years passed, decades. She never forgot about that night, but it faded into memory until 2021. That's when she got the call. Detectives. A man had been remanded on suspicion of multiple rapes and murders dating back to the 80s. DNA had finally caught up with him, not his, but a relative's, which had led the police straight to his door. And the descriptions of the man my mom had reported all those years ago, they matched. Then came the detail that made her blood run cold. One of his known victims had lived just a street away from her back then. She had the same name. She looked strikingly similar. It was likely that the man standing on her doorstep that night had been looking for his next victim. And my mom? She had just barely slipped through his grasp. The police invited us to the sentencing. Sitting in the courtroom, we saw him in the dock. My mom stared at him, and in that moment, she knew. It was him, the man from the doorstep, the one who wouldn't meet her eyes. He was sentenced to life for the murders, but the horror didn't end there. When they arrested him and searched his property, they uncovered something far worse. For years, he had been abusing bodies in the hospital mortuary where he worked. He wasn't just a killer, he was a monster. And if my mom had opened that door that night, I might not be here to tell this story.